Hi everyone, this is Laura Slade, and in today's lesson we're going to talk about the idea of population change. There are three things that we're going to investigate in terms of how they relate to population change, and those are the properties of variation, adaptation, and natural selection. So let's begin by looking at a model population. For example, here we might have all of the dogs living in Calgary this year. Now this meets our definition of a population because it includes same species, dogs, living in the same place, Calgary, at the same time this year. And if you were to compare this population of dogs to a population of dogs in Calgary a few hundred years ago, or even to a population in another part of the world, maybe Europe, several hundred years ago, likely you're going to see a big difference, that the population of dogs has changed over time. And the ability for populations to change really comes down to one observation, and that's the fact that no two individuals are ever exactly the same within a population. We call this observation variation. So there are some very clear variations in this dog population. For example, some of the dogs differ in height, weight, or fur length. There may also be some variations that are not visible. Maybe some of the dogs are good runners, maybe some are efficient swimmers, and still others might be great at playing catch. We're going to see this same property of variation no matter what population we look at. So maybe you could observe some variation in the color of the flower petals in the snap peas in your grandma's garden this summer. And we also see these variations when we look at the human population. Some of them are visible, like skin color, but of course we know that there are many, many different variations that make each human individual different from the next. When we study variation in the population, what we find out is that some variations are encoded by genes. Now, genes are basically a set of instructions for the cell. They are the information contained in DNA, which is found inside the nucleus of basically all of your cells. And these genes tell your cells how to function. Taken as a whole, the genes in all of your cells, they tell an organism how to function, and they also determine what type of variation you'll display. Now what happens is that individuals pass on their DNA in either egg cells or sperm cells to their offspring when they reproduce. And that means that we share these set of instructions with our children. So any variation that's encoded by genes, we can call a heritable variation. That means it's variation that you can inherit from your parents. In other words, offspring tend to look like their parents because they share much of their genetic variation. At the level of a population, this means that if a particular individual survives and reproduces, then they're going to pass their genes and their variations onto their offspring. A consequence of this is that if you have variation or genes that actually help you to survive and reproduce, then those genes are going to be passed on to the next generation in the population more often because you're going to survive and reproduce more. This idea of variable gene transmission from parents to their offspring in a population, it's the basis for population change. And it's also the foundation for the theory of evolution, which we're going to talk about in our next lesson. For now, let's compare the two different ways that organisms can pass their genes, their DNA, onto their offspring. The first method is called asexual reproduction. In this type of reproduction, parents basically copy themselves, split themselves in half, and produce two new identical copies of themselves. This process can happen over and over again until a few generations later we have hundreds or even thousands of exact copies of the original parent. And because those offspring are identical to their parents, we call them clones. They should share all of their traits, all their variations with their parents. On the other hand, sexual reproduction is a method by which two individuals each take half of their genetic information and pass it on to their offspring. This means that the offspring is a unique combination of their parents' genetic traits, and they might not be exactly like either parent. So in comparison, there's very little way for asexual reproduction to produce new variation. It pretty much relies on a process called mutation, in which there's a totally random change in the DNA in the nucleus, which just happens to cause a new variation or a new trait to appear. This can happen just because when DNA is replicated so much, there are naturally errors. It can also happen because of processes that we call mutagens. In other words, they cause mutations. This includes things like UV damage and other harmful chemicals. So although asexual populations can replicate very quickly, they tend to have little variation among them. On the other hand, sexually reproducing populations shuffle their genetic information with every single new generation, and so there tends to be a lot more differences between individuals. Let's look at an example of how variation can lead to a change in a population over time. In this example, we're going to be talking about a population of pea plants that are growing in your backyard this summer. What we can notice is that different pea plants have different length stems, and this counts as variation within the population. The next thing that we might notice is that offspring tend to look like their parents, and this tells us that stem length is a heritable variation. In other words, if you breed together two pea plants with short stems, their offspring are going to have short stems. And on the other hand, if you breed together two pea plants with long stems, their offspring will have long stems. This tells us that the variation for stem length is genetic. It's carried in the genes of the organisms. Now, something is going to happen in your garden. Suddenly, your garden becomes overgrown with other plants. What you can see here is that these rose flowers are blocking out the sunlight for all of the plants that are growing beneath them. That means that our short pea plants are not going to have enough light to photosynthesize, and maybe they're all going to die. Suddenly, it has become better to be a tall pea plant because you're more likely to survive, and therefore you're more likely to reproduce. A variation that helps you to survive and reproduce is called an adaptation. It's beneficial for the environment that you live in. In this case, the environment is an overgrown garden, and the benefit of being tall is the ability to capture more light for photosynthesis. What will be the result of this? Well, if more tall pea plants survive and reproduce, then they're going to make more tall offspring. And eventually we'll be able to observe a change in the average stem length in the population over time. In other words, the pea plants are going to get taller. We're going to see a lot more tall stems than short stems. This change in the characteristics of a population over time due to preferential reproduction of a well-adapted individual, this is called natural selection. Now that's a pretty lengthy definition, but let's break this down. We've seen the change in characteristic, and that is that the plants are getting taller. And it's happening because tall individuals are surviving and reproducing more often. And that means that the genetic information for tall gets passed on to the next generation more. Now, this instance of natural selection was caused by a change in the environment. Remember, the population was totally fine before the garden became overgrown, but once those plants started blocking out the light for the short pea plants, that's when it became more advantageous to be a tall plant. And this idea of a changing environment causing a change in the population, this is called selective pressure. In other words, the bushes that are growing in the garden are putting selective pressure on the pea plants. They're basically pressuring them to be taller. Now there's one more detail I want to emphasize, and that's the fact that in our example, short pea plants cannot grow taller in order to compete for sunlight because it's just not in their genetic information. They don't have the instructions for being tall. So when we talk about a change over time, it is not the individuals that are changing, it's the population. Short pea plants are going to stay short. Tall pea plants are going to stay tall. The difference is the number of short pea plants compared to tall pea plants is changing over time. Let's look at another example that shows how variation can lead to a change in the population. And this time, we're going to look at a population of peacocks. Maybe it'll be the population of peacocks that lived in the Calgary Zoo before the flood last summer. Now, the male peacocks are called cocks, and the females are called hens. And if we look at the males, the cocks, what we see is that they have different size tails, and this counts as a variation. So some cocks have very long tails, and other cocks might have pretty short tails. And what can we find out about this variation? Well, it turns out that offspring tend to look like their parents, which means that tail length in peacocks is heritable. You get it from the set of instructions in the DNA of your parents. So if we take peacocks with short tails, they'll have offspring with short tails, whereas peacocks with long tails, they're going to tend to have offspring with long tails. Now, just like in our example before, something is going to change, and that's the fact that females, the pea hens, are going to decide that long tails are more attractive. And these pea hens are going to preferentially mate with males that have long tails. So tail length doesn't seem to affect the survival of the peacocks, but it does affect their ability to reproduce, because if you can't attract a mate, you don't get to have offspring. So because of its reproductive advantages, having a long tail counts as an adaptation. Or we could say that the preferential choosing of the pea hens is putting selective pressure on the peacocks to have long tails. So what's going to happen in our population? Well, eventually there is going to be a change in the average tail length in this population over time. We're going to see more and more peacocks born with long tails and fewer short tails as the population changes. And this is another example of natural selection. In other words, we've seen a change in the characteristics of a population over time due to preferential reproduction of well-adapted individuals. And what does it mean to be well-adapted? Well, in this case, that genetic information for the more attractive, sexy long tail, it gets passed on to the next generation more often. Now, our peacock example is actually a special type of natural selection. It's called sexual selection. And we use this term to highlight the difference between when an adaptation helps you to survive, like it did in the stem length of our pea plants, versus when an adaptation helps you to reproduce, like these long tails do. Now, we're not going to talk very much about sexual selection in our course because it's actually a pretty complicated idea, and we can save it for Bio 30 or even on into university courses. But just to give you a preview of what's to come, sexual selection can account for some really crazy variations in different populations, like the peacock's long tail, or the big antlers on deer, or even the gigantic size of a male walrus. Let's talk about some other kind of subtleties of the idea of a population change. One of the complications that we can notice is that not all variations are visible. Some of them are kind of hidden inside the functioning of the body of an organism. We call these adaptations physiological. There's something about the metabolism or the chemistry of an organism that helps them to survive. And a really great example of that is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So what you're observing here, this is a plate, an agar plate of bacteria cells. And the bacteria are microscopic. We can't see them, but we can't see the haze, the kind of cloud that they form around most of the whole plate. Then, scientists have added a few basically discs of antibiotics, something that usually kills bacteria cells, and they're located here all around the plate. Now, most of the bacteria cannot survive and cannot reproduce where antibiotics are present, and so that cloud that showed us where bacteria were growing, it's absent around most of these antibiotic discs. But what we see is that there are a few discs where bacteria are growing right up to and even over top of those antibiotics. What that tells us is that these bacteria growing in this part of the plate have a special adaptation. They are antibiotic resistant. Something about their physiology allows them to grow where most other bacteria couldn't. And the study of these physiological adaptations of antibiotic resistance in bacteria takes up a huge amount of study and investigation in the field of medicine. The next thing that we can notice is that not all variations are good. In fact, most variations are bad. For example, being farsighted or nearsighted and therefore needing glasses tends to run in families. That tells us that it's heritable. If your parents wear glasses, chances are you need glasses as well. This variation, the genetic information for bad eyesight, is actually disadvantageous. It does not help you survive. Now, these days, you go to the optometrist, you get a pair of glasses or contacts, and you're good to go. But imagine our distant ancestors living in a time of hunting and gathering when there are no such thing as glasses. In that case, being farsighted or nearsighted might actually get you killed. You might not survive and reproduce as frequently. And that means that genetic information for disadvantageous traits gets passed on to the next generation less. Now, we can't undervalue this observation that very few random mutations causing variation are actually good. Just so happens this is one of the major arguments against the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, and that's something we're going to talk about tomorrow. The next thing that we can notice about natural selection is that the more generations go by, the more opportunity there is for populations to change. And in species that reproduce and grow slowly, like humans or elephants, who have an even longer lifespan than we do, change takes a long time to come around. But in insects, like the fruit flies that you see here, they have many generations within the span of even a few months, and so their populations can change very quickly. Now you think that fruit flies reproduce quickly, while human pathogens like viruses and bacteria reproduce even faster, and their populations can change at an alarming rate. This is the reason why if you get a flu shot this year, you still need a new one next year, because the flu is caused by a virus that changes so quickly. Next year's flu will be basically a totally different organism than this year's flu, and so the same flu shot will not necessarily work. And finally, what we can notice is that in order for natural selection to occur, there actually has to be variation in the population. And as we mentioned at the beginning of today's lesson, variation is more common in populations that are sexually reproducing. And when asexual reproduction is happening and clones are being made, there is very little variation. So if there is a selective pressure against that population, there might not actually be any individuals who are well adapted to it, and the whole population can crumble. But bacteria are not the only organisms that reproduce asexually. Here are actually two examples of plants that can sometimes choose to reproduce asexually. So this is a weed, I believe, and if you were to look at this weed while it was growing in the ground, it might look like maybe 5 to 10 different individuals. And in that case, you could assume that maybe all the individuals were a little bit different, that they had variation. But it turns out that they're not, and they don't. All of these stems that we see in this sample are actually from the same individual. That's because this weed has a special type of root that grows along the ground just underneath the top of the soil, and every now and then a new stem will pop up. But these are all the same individual, and therefore they're going to have no variation between them. This is a small-scale view of this process of asexual reproduction, but actually the same process is happening in this forest of aspen trees. They also use these lateral roots that grow underground, they're called runners, and pop up a new stem every few meters. So you might think that you're looking at a forest full of different individual trees, but actually you're looking at different stems of the same tree, and there's no variation between them. No variation means that they all have the same adaptations, and if the environmental conditions change and create a new selective pressure, there may or may not be any individuals in the population that are adapted to it, and so the population might not change. So to summarize what we've talked about today, we've said that variation are changes that exist within every population. If those changes are beneficial to the current environment, if they help you to survive and reproduce, then we call those variations adaptations. And quite often, over time, as the environment changes, different selective pressures will cause different traits to be adaptations. And the population might change in response to that environmental condition. And the change in population over time due to preferential reproduction of well-adapted individuals, that's called natural selection. And what you're going to find out about tomorrow is that you now have all of the information that Charles Darwin gathered in order to propose his theory of evolution. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you guys next time.